Allow me to introduce myself. Who knows what dastardly crime he might perpetrate next?
He's a very clever arch criminal who must be put away. Another innocent victim of suicidal mania.
In our anti-racism training sessions with Crossroads, we were able to learn about the history of racism. We started by making a wall of history, first learning about the doctrines of domination, which is when the church made it legal for Europeans to steal land away from its native people or take people from their native land, such as the invasion of Christopher Columbus and the beginning of slavery. Racism is so deeply embedded into the history of America, and we are able to see throughout time how it has been manifested through governmental policy, like the Jim Crow laws, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the laws like Stop and Frisk. So what is racism? It is the combination of race prejudice and the misuse of power by institutions and systems. Both components perpetuate acts of racism, and this means that racism is a human-to-system relationship rather than just an interpersonal one. Racism is used to uphold the values of white supremacy, keeping what Gloria Anzaldúa explains as the marginalized in the borderlands and the dominant culture at the center. So, how does this deep history of segregation manifest in cities like Chicago today? We began our journey in Hyde Park.
Hyde Park was also known as one of the few neighborhoods in Chicago that was like a progressive neighborhood. So if you wanted to have relationships or be married to a person who was white, if you were African American, Hyde Park is one of the few neighborhoods you can move to. In fact, it was the only neighborhood in the city of Chicago you could move to. And so Hyde Park became a home of a lot of progressive black folks. So if you were into things, anything progressive, Hyde Park is the place you wanted to be. So a lot of comedy, poetry, arts, and things like that for black folks were centered around Hyde Park. But if you lived in Hyde Park, you were considered to be bougie black folk. And this was the neighborhood for bougie black folk, in part because it was integrated. People actually had relationships with other races, and you could expose yourself that often was not acceptable in other black neighborhoods. In Chicago, you might hear the phrase that Chicago is nothing but Mississippi North, because most of the black areas in Chicago where people migrated, and we'll talk about this a little bit from the South, ended up with very Southern culture on the South side of Chicago. Hyde Park was a place for black folk who wanted to escape that traditional black culture and live a more progressive life. White folks have no idea that it exists. The assumption for most white people in Chicago is that once you go to the South Side, which is across 12th Street, there's nothing but drugs, gangs, and dying people all over the place. When I went to college, I remember, again, back in 1980, I would meet white people, and they would ask me where I was from, and I'd say the South Side of Chicago. And they'd say, "Oh my God, how did you ever survive?" And I was really confused at first, because I grew up in a neighborhood like this, and I didn't understand that the rest of the world assumed that I was raised in the projects or some kind of ghetto. That still exists today. I bring white people over here who live in Chicago, and they say, "I had no idea that neighborhoods like this exist." And they ask me if black folk live in these houses, and the answer is yes. Not exclusively, because it's still connected to the University of Chicago. So many professors, many people who work for the university live in these houses as well. But it is indeed an integrated neighborhood, and many of these houses are owned and occupied by African American people.
And then another thing we're working on is like language access. Language issue is a big problem for Asian Americans, but also African immigrants in the area. Something that's particular to Chicago is that our emergency services and 311 services there's no clear plan as to how calls are being taken in. So what we hear from community is that if they call the police department or if they call 911, 911 dispatchers will tell them to wait while they find someone to then interpret for them, or they'll say, could you find someone and then call us back? So a lot of, especially domestic violence victims, have to then call, some 1-800 hotline, and then they can't direct, some of their issues to emergency services. And so these are some of the issues that we're working on in Chicago. It's interesting because I think a lot of cities frames itself as being very progressive and like this liberal city, but we know that there's a lack of services to a lot of the smaller marginalized communities.
University of Chicago was an older hospital. Northwestern built brand new hospitals, multi-billion-dollar hospitals. So the University of Chicago, in order to compete, also built a brand new hospital just on the other side of these buildings. But again, we've talked a lot about the University of Chicago being on the south side, and some of the neighborhoods surrounding here are gang-infested, very dangerous neighborhoods. And a lot of trauma, gunshots, car accidents, things like that happen to people of color on the south side. But when the university built their new hospital, they made a conscious, intentional decision not to build a trauma center here on campus. And so that means that if you get shot anywhere in this neighborhood, you have to be airlifted to another hospital several miles away.
Of the police and investing more and more into the surveillance technology that the police is expanding. And they're talking about hiring 1,000 new officers to address the violence in Chicago. The violence in Chicago is engineered by the closing of schools, the closing of mental health facilities, the divestment of neighborhoods.
When this was first built, all of this area around here was industrial. It is now gentrified, and it is now an opportunity zone, which means that there's lots and lots of people of wealth that live in this community. And CHA now has come in 15 years ago and said, we're going to change this into a mixed income community. And everyone has said, why? Why are you going to put mixed income community here when it's already a mixed income community? Why are you going to push poor people out of this community, because that's what it will accomplish, and force them into areas that are more segregated and more poor, because that's what has happened in other instances. So that's why this has been such a big fight. You're going to be right along the Chicago River. That is the dividing line between what's Lincoln Park, which is the wealthy part of the community, and Logan Square, which is gentrifying. Everybody looks at what the CHA is doing and says it's a land grab, and the purpose of it is to create an economic bridge between wealth and where they want the wealth to go. And poor people don't fit. The CHA has said, we're going to fix up a number of these townhouses, and we're going to move you out of your unit temporarily into these other units so that we can fix your apartment and move you back in to your old apartment. And our question immediately was, and the residents' question was, how come you couldn't do that 5 years ago? How come you couldn't lease out these units, fix them up and lease them out to get the population higher? But that's not what the CHA did. The CHA has said, yeah, well, they have lots of money. They have $450 million in the bank.
Federal money.
Of federal money. And they're just holding on to it, and they don't want to do anything.
So in Chicago, as in many quote-unquote inner cities across the country, there's this phenomenon with corner stores, right? Where you have, an immigrant-owned, corner store operating in a predominantly low-income community of color, oftentimes a black community. And at these stores, I mean, who knows what I'm talking about, right? I mean, right? I think everybody's probably seen that, right? You see, you walk in, oftentimes aesthetically, the same, you have bars on the windows, you have bulletproof glass around the register. When it comes to the type of inventory that's at the stores, you're talking, tobacco products, liquor, you're talking absolute junk food, and then oftentimes the type of service too isn't there, and there's definitely a racial undertone, to this type of service that's offered, and just the overall lack of dignity and respect of the place. And so,
right. So just imagine, when we talk about, if you think about food deserts and all these other, and this is a health desert, you think about a space desert. And the fact that people don't have enough space. So you can look at the most elaborate studies that's ever, articulated from Northwestern, talk about, crime and violence related to corner stores. It's because people don't have space. So they hang out in front of the corner stores and the liquor stores, and ultimately conflict will take place in very low-income communities, and marginalized communities. So.
A lot of terms that we use as far as like race, ethnicity, nationality, it's really just terms to keep us in these different sections. We're black, white, Asian, like Latina, but in my opinion, I just feel like they put us into these racial categories and have us mark what we are and how much we make and everything, just to classify us more and to like separate us more. So
this experience changed my perspective in realizing that underrepresented groups, people of color, people on the borderlands, as we talked about, it really doesn't matter what our differences are in terms of how we're oppressed. The fact is, we're all trying to, fight white supremacy and white privilege, and to get rid of this idea that everything that we do and who we are needs to be in the center, and that we have to assimilate in some way. And realizing that our struggles and our issues in our individual communities really is important to bring it all together rather than just focusing on one individual community. Because I think that's a part of the reason why we're not really able to move forward, is because we're so focused on our issues and realizing there's actually a larger issue that plays into all of the oppression that's happening within our communities.
It has really changed my perspective, because I thought that racial issues were mostly just black and white.
Before, I guess I wasn't really that active in racial justice, but after the trip I think I want to become more involved because of the different communities that we saw and how they're each being affected by this kind of idea of white supremacy. And as a white male, I don't want to be a perpetrator of that, rather I want to be their ally and see how I can help.
Before going to the trip, I took in what the media portrayed the South Side of Chicago to be. I thought it was just people literally running around with guns, and I should have known better. I'm from Compton. It has similar stereotypes to it, and that wasn't the case. We were in a very, I guess you could say, beautiful neighborhood, but with the beauty, there's also the back sides to it. There was heavy policing in the campus where we were at. It was the University of Chicago, but it also shows that the media portrays the South Side as simply that.
My favorite community or site visit that we went on was actually the Ecumenical Alliance group. I think especially coming from a school that is considered religious, has a religious affiliation, it was really amazing to see the actual work that these religious organizations and churches are doing in their community, and how much of an impact they've had, but also to just have an honest conversation with them about their struggles and about how things don't always work out the way they want them to, but at the end of the day, they know that they're serving their community. And it made me really reflect on who we are as an institution, what the church can do, what the Jesuit Society can do, to also continue to play a role in the people that they're serving. So the diversity of the students that we have on campus, the diversity of communities that they're in. I really enjoyed hearing their perspective and seeing how different religious groups were actually coming together for a specific cause, which is really to serve their people.
Thank you.